Stanford University.
Good evening. I'm Dr. Tia Rich, and I have the pleasure of directing the Stanford Contemplation by Design program. This is the 6th summit, the 7th year that we've been offering contemplative practices to the community. It's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Victor Carrion, who is sharing his research, which he shared some preliminary findings in the 2015 summit. So he is our first alumni of this program to come back and share further findings of his pioneering and inspiring work. I'd like to thank him and thank his colleagues in advance of their presentation. And since we are always inviting everyone, whether it's a participant or a presenter, to enjoy the power of pause, we have tea mugs and boxes of tea to allow them to rest and pause. So I'd like to ask Anne Contreras and Chi Kim to come forward and receive their gifts. And then Victor Carrion has his from 2015, so the three of them can have tea together.
Thank you.
So without further ado, I invite Dr. Carrion, who's a professor of adolescent and child psychiatry here at Stanford, to share his wonderful work. Thank you.
Thank you, Tia. Thank you so much for having us here this year, and thank you all for being here. And I hope that you enjoy also the full program that the Contemplation by Design has prepared for you. I'm from Puerto Rico originally. I trained on the East Coast, and I came here to do child psychiatry. So part of my training was here as well, and that was 25 years ago. And when I was training, I kept getting these notes. I was training for child and adolescent psychiatry, and I was getting these notes saying, this child has ADHD, please place on Ritalin. And I was like, wow, they're telling me what the kid has. There's a treatment plan already. What am I training for? Some of those kids did have ADHD. A lot of them didn't. A lot of them were living in such adversity that they were very hypervigilant of their environment, and they were very anxious. They were probably the opposite of what we're talking about this week, the opposite of contemplation. Traumatic life and stressful events and anxiety has taken away from them that ability that many children have to contemplate. And sometimes that is expressed in play. And what trauma does when a child experiences it is that it robs kids from play. All of a sudden, the play becomes traumatic. We call it traumatic play. What that means is that it's a repetitive play that is non-joyful. And in a way, it is there as an attempt to try to process the event and try to communicate it. But play, normal play, is so essential for a child. This is how they develop socially. This is how they develop emotionally, motor-wise, in many facets, that trauma actually takes that away. So I became interested in how do we bring back this ability to children to contemplate and to be in peace and to be able to play and to build resilience. Because yes, it needs to be built. This idea that children are resilient by virtue of being children is not true. There's nothing in the scientific literature that actually supports that. In fact, the opposite is true. That's why we need to take care of children, because they're more vulnerable. They're more vulnerable than adults. And many studies have demonstrated that if you see how a population manages a traumatic event, we're having the fires now, right? If we look at the families that are losing homes, that need to evacuate, that have losses, studies have been done on earthquakes as well. And we look at who gets more affected, adults or children. Children get more affected. They really, really develop more anxiety and more symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder than adults. So How do we then bring them the opportunities and the abilities to find in themselves the ability to process these events so that they can actually be mindful, they can contemplate, and they can see their body as a tool to feel better and to improve their life? That's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about how do we help children to become resilient, and what problems do we have with that word? How do we understand resilience? So we're going to spend some time talking about resilience, which is different than adaptation and has some issues of its own. So we'll do that. But before we do that, I know that for many of you, this is the end of the day. For many of you, this is the beginning of the evening. And there are many things that we all have in our head in terms of things that happened today or where we are headed after this and things like that. And so that we can all unify and be here in the moment and really share with each other what we are all going to talk about, we're going to take a minute to do an exercise that's going to help us all be mindful and be in the moment. And this is going to be done by one of my colleagues, Anne Contreras. Something that I'm going to talk about today also is the importance of developing partnerships when working towards helping children. We cannot do it alone. We cannot expect parents and caretakers to really build resilient children. We cannot expect pediatricians to do that. We cannot expect teachers to do that. But we can expect all of them to work together towards that goal. It does take a village. So one of my partners is Pure Edge, and you're going to learn a lot about Pure Edge today. But the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to take a little bit of a time with Anne's help, and she's going to guide us through an exercise so that we can all experience that. So let's do that.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Carrion. Good evening. So if everyone could sit on the edge of their seats, close up their notepads, smartphones, laptops, and make sure that the soles of the feet are on the ground. Maybe some of you already have a practice such as this, right? Okay. Make sure the knees are bent at a 90-degree angle, lifting the chest. Yes. Taking the palms of the hands, facing them up or down. And then if you feel comfortable, you can close your eyes or just take the gaze down and forward. And then taking the first inhale through the nose and exhale through the nose. Inhale. And exhale. 3 more to go. Inhale. And exhale. Inhale. And exhale. Inhale. And exhale. And keeping the eyes closed or the gaze down and forward. Keep lifting the chest, but relax the shoulders down. We're going to do a quick practice called taking in the good. So focusing on the breath. On the next breath, thinking of someone or something that you are grateful for. And on that next breath, silently showing appreciation to that person or thing. And then on your next breath, thinking of someone else or something else that you are grateful for. And then again on the next breath, silently showing appreciation to that person or thing. then just to move into a little bit of our own self-care on your next breath. Think of something in yourself that you are grateful for. And silently showing appreciation to yourself. And then keeping the eyes closed or the gaze down and forward. On your next breath, slowly lowering the chin towards the chest. And then on the next breath, keeping the gaze down, slowly opening the eyes, focusing on the ground, wiggling the fingers. And then when you're ready, on the next breath, lifting the chin up and coming into the room. All right, good evening.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
We've arrived.
We have arrived.
So, one thing that I want to mention when I talk about health and when I talked about resilience, I really want to be very broad, and I want to share with you the broad definition that I have, because I'm a physician, but I'm really not talking about the absence of illness. I think a healthy child is a child that, yes, has no illness, but is also educated, demonstrates gratitude, has appreciation, and eventually becomes a good citizen, right? So how do we achieve all of that? That's why the approach that we need to do, as you can tell, is multidisciplinary and involves a lot of people. Okay. Let's talk about resilience. Resilience is a physics term, right? It means that you bounce back to the state that you were originally. And that's very good, but it's not everything we need. There's another concept called adaptation. And adaptation means that you're in a different place, not in the place where you started, but through the experiences that you've had, you've reached a new place, and that place may be better or not than the place that you were before, but you have adapted to those changes, and now you are at a different place. So we need children to not only be resilient, but we also need them to be adaptable. Now, there is a problem with the way that we use the term now, at least in the medical field, because we refer to resilient children as children that are demonstrating no problems, or have no symptoms, or have no health issues. So we use this threshold model, really, where above that threshold, there is functional impairment, there is pathology, or there are problems, or something is being manifested that you don't like. And then that below that, everything is okay. But the problem is that below this, we have a really heterogeneous group. Because we have the group that's here, something happens and bounces back, like we talked before. We have the truly resilient individual, right? But we have other individuals and other children where the events are adding up into the stressful events are adding up into what we call the allostatic load, which is the backpack that we all carry, right? And we really can carry stress. And we don't want a stress-free life, because we need stress to develop. But if that backpack gets heavier and heavier, and you're 5, 6, 7 years old, you can fall backwards. You know, it can be too much of a load, that's why it's called an allostatic load. But right now, we have no way of deciphering, and I want you to think about this, because we need new ideas on how do we actually identify that youth that is accumulating and accumulating, but is still below the threshold. So it really takes one more event, and they're going to cross this threshold. But we are missing the opportunity to intervene early, right? And if we intervene on everyone, we're intervening on a very big group because there's a lot of individuals that are truly resilient or adaptable, but we need to identify this group. So when I talk about the threshold model and functional impairment, this is what we're talking about. So the type, the number, the severity, the duration, the age of onset of the stressors, all of these are important factors in determining how heavy that backpack is going to be. What is that charge that we're going to have, that allostatic load? So in the same way that we have homeostasis, for example, to regulate our temperature, we can be in different temperatures and our body adapts to that. That's homeostasis. We have a homeostasis for stress. We can manage stress. And like I said before, we in fact need stress to develop, right? It's an inverted U-curve shape. Let me see if I have this here. No, I don't, but let me talk about this now. The more stressed we are up to an optimal point, the better we're going to perform, the healthier we are going to be. If we don't care about that exam that we're going to have tomorrow, we'll probably fail. So we need to be stressed up to an optimal point. Then what happens after that optimal point is that the more and more stress accumulates, then that function starts to decline, and that health and that performance starts to decline. So it's an inverted U-curve shape. Now, what is going to make us go into that second half of the curve are all of these factors here. If there's just too much stressors, the type, right? If there's personal invasion or attack, how severe it is. If it's chronic, if it lasts for a long time. Sometimes there are individuals that are really very far from the threshold. According to their genes, they're never going to develop these disorders. But if they experience a chronic stressor like child maltreatment, for example, which is something that starts at critical ages and is chronic and it's constant and is severe, then you can reach that threshold almost as if you were born with a genetic makeup where you were right here, right? For the individuals that are born with a genetic makeup that are right here, sometimes all it takes is that one event, right? Like that fire or that exposure to that war. But we know from work with veterans, for example, that went to Vietnam, that those individuals that develop PTSD after Vietnam had significantly more history of child maltreatment than the ones that didn't. So it wasn't only the Vietnam experience, although for some it was, but it was the accumulation of stressors. It was a very heavy backpack, a very heavy load that was difficult to adjust with our homeostasis for stressors. What do we know that brings resilience? Well, the one factor that's in the literature that is the strongest factor is the presence of an adult that was there to listen, that was there to provide opportunity, that was there to give some counseling for the child. Now, we don't know what that means. That could mean that there are certain children that are very good at seeking that type of relationship with an adult, right? And that can be the resilient factor. So there's still a lot of work in terms of understanding resilience that we need to do. But we know that children that are resilient, and adults really, do have those relationships, also are very creative. They are in situations where they learn to problem solve. They are challenged by conflicts in life. One of the worries that I really have is when we take too much care of kids and we don't actually let them be challenged and we don't let them problem solve on their own. If we facilitate and make everything easy for them, which we sometimes do when our own history was not like that and we want to compensate and make sure that they're okay, so I understand their reaction. But when we do that, what happens is that we're sending kids into the world that are expecting that from the world, that things are going to be solved for them. And then at these critical times and these critical periods, they have not developed the ability to problem solve, to be creative, and come up with other, develop other things that are going to help them move ahead. And one of those that is very important is persistence. It's the ability that if something didn't work the first time, and I really feel very strongly about this, I'm going to try again, and I'm going to try again. Now, while I'm saying this, let me talk about the theory of belonging a little bit, because we also have difficulty and we have problems when there are children that identified only in one way. So, for example, if my whole identity is to be an athlete and it doesn't go well, my whole identity is gone with that, right? If my whole identity is to be a 4.0 plus student, to be academically excellent, and I'm not, I'm 3.8, my whole identity goes away with it. So the theory of belonging tells us that we really need to give opportunities to the child to see their true selves in many different facets of life, where they are an athlete, they are a student, they are a community participant, they're someone who plays the guitar. There are many different things, right? So that when something doesn't go well, or even when they perceive that it's not going well, it might be not going bad, but they may perceive that it's going bad, they have other things. They have other things. And that loss of identity is very dangerous. That loss of identity is something that puts some kids at the risk of suicide, because it's really problematic, and it's really difficult for them. Ability to soothe themselves is important. Emotion regulation is important. I want to talk about cognitive flexibility, because I started the talk by talking about the hypervigilance that many of these children develop when there's traumatic stress in their lives. And so my goal early in my career was, okay, what do I need to do to get rid of hypervigilance? Until I was in the Bayview, and one mom told me, when my kid comes home at night and he comes to our dark street and there are people following him, I want him to be hypervigilant. I actually want him to be watching. So then eventually, through those messages, I realized this is not about getting rid of hypervigilance, but the problem in PTSD and post-traumatic reactions in children is that when they become hypervigilant, they lose the ability to know when to turn it on or when to turn it off. So they may be in their school class, right? A year after they experience violence at home, and there's a lot of noise in the classroom, and they leave running. And no one knows why the kid is doing that, even himself or herself. And they're doing that because the noise is a cue, and the body had an adaptive response at one point, which was to get away from the situation and that way protect themselves. But now, when they behave that way automatically, that adaptive way is not adaptive anymore, it's maladaptive, right? And they get in trouble in school. But no one has that context. No one knows what's happening. So the kid gets labeled as a problem or bad, or he has issues or crazy or whatever. And at a very, very sensitive time in this kid's life, because he's developing his identity, right? And all of a sudden he's a problem. So if he's a problem, he needs to be true to his identity, because he needs to develop a sense of who he is. So he's going to behave like a problem child, because that's who he is. That's what we've been telling him. So it gets very complicated. But this issue of knowing when to turn on the hypervigilance and when not to turn it on, when to turn it off, is cognitive flexibility. It's the ability to think, this is not a threatening situation, I am okay, this is not a dark alley on my way home, I can stay in the classroom because it's a safe place. But that doesn't happen spontaneously. We need to help the child get to that. And in order to do that, he needs to understand why he's hypervigilant in the first place. So we actually need to teach some classical conditioning, some understanding as to why his body is responding to those cues and those triggers. So these are things that we know are really important. Now let's talk about the misconceptions in resilience. Just that same idea of the threshold model. No behavioral symptoms equals resilience. There should be a slash there saying no. That's not a good definition for resilience. Children are resilient by virtue of being children. No, that's not the case. They're more vulnerable. We need to help them become resilient. You're not born with it. You may be born with some traits and some temperaments that are helpful to absorb all this information. You may be born with some of the genes that code for some of these things, but without the right environmental input, these genes may not express themselves. So we really need to do this in a very individualized fashion, right? Here at Stanford, we call it individualized medicine, personalized medicine. And this whole idea that you're resilient or not, right, like the way we've been talking about this morning, today, is not good either. It's not like one is resilient or one is not resilient. You may be resilient to some factors and some other factors you may not be resilient. So you may be able to adapt under certain situations and you not may be able to adapt under others. So we need to develop maps that really can teach us what the areas in which the kid needs more help. So how do we promote resilience? Well, the first thing is that it's never too late, right? It's like, I don't want anyone to think that, it's 0 to 3 has happened already, so it's too late for this kid. It can be revisited in the school years. If you've missed that, adolescence is a good period. Again, it's another critical period. So it's never too late to intervene, and hopefully we're all growing, right, all the time. And we know when we look at the development of the brain that there are areas of the brain that continue to develop throughout life. And a very important one of those that I'm going to talk about in a little bit is the prefrontal cortex, where we see that the ability to develop executive function through the development of the prefrontal cortex and areas that are linked to the prefrontal cortex continues to be developed through the 20s. So if you have a kid that is very impulsive and so forth, that kid actually may develop this ability later on. And since we've been looking at this, it keeps moving. It used to be like late teens, then early 20s, then mid-20s, then late 20s. So my guess is that it's like 50s. and that some of us are still developing our prefrontal cortex. The spectrum of interventions means that we're going to talk about a few of those today. I'm going to talk about a manual that I developed to treat children that have experienced trauma called Q-Center Therapy, and is based on that classical conditioning that I was talking about. But I'm also going to talk about this project that we've been doing in partnership with Pure Edge on yoga and mindfulness. So there's really a big spectrum of interventions and things we can do for kids. And one way of thinking about it is to think about a triangle and think about the triangle divided in 3 parts and think, well, what do we need at the base? What do we need for every kid? You know, what would be good to offer every child? And then as we get to that apex where individuals need some individual treatment, what do we need in the middle, right? Like group treatments and things like that. So there's all types of intervention that can help develop the traits that I talked about. Like I said at the beginning, don't go it alone. Really, it takes a village. It's not a teacher's job. It's not a parent's job. It's not a pediatrician's job. It's the whole community. It's everyone working together. And really, and I don't think we are done with this, we have to develop systems that facilitate the coming together of all these individuals and the communication of all these individuals in the guidance and the growth of a child. We promote resilience through the development of self-efficacy and empowerment. One thing that I think often is that we always talk about tools and tools that kids can have and things like that. For me, the most important tool that they have, And one of the reasons why we involve yoga in the treatment is their body and is themselves, because it doesn't matter where they're going to end up 20, 30, 40 years from now. Something they're always going to have with them is themselves. And yes, it's great to know about resources, and it's great to know that you can go to other people for help, and it's great to know that there are therapists out there. But how empowering to know that you can start with yourself, right? That there are ways in which you can think, there are ways in which you can behave, there are exercises that you can do that can at least help you start getting on the right track. And of course, seek those resources and seek that help, but see yourself as your most important tool. So we can talk a little bit more about that. It's an important component of this Q-center therapy that I've talked about. We have made some advancements in the field in understanding the areas that we need to work on. So I was talking about the prefrontal cortex, for example, and I was talking about executive function. Another area is the limbic system, the amygdala, the hippocampus. That has to do with emotion regulation. And of course, it's a lot more complicated than that. There's a lot of networks that communicate these two areas and many different regions of interest in the brain. And we are constantly identifying those. But something that we have done in my laboratory and some colleagues on the East Coast is that we have clearly demonstrated that there are certain paths that get altered with the experience of that allostatic load, of that chronic stress, of that accumulation. And we did that for a number of reasons. First, to demonstrate that it is an entity and that it really, children can have, that stress can have an impact in the development of the brain, but also to know what needs to be targeted when we talk about interventions. And I'm talking about interventions very broadly, right? When we talk about mindfulness, can mindfulness really help some of these networks? And we strongly believe that it does. And I have some evidence to show you on that. We have also done work on the hormone cortisol, demonstrating that these children tend to have high levels of cortisol. This was very worrisome to us because Robert Sapolsky, who was doing similar work here in the Department of Biology, working with mice, demonstrated that cortisol can be neurotoxic to sensitive areas of the brain. So when we did this work, we became very concerned that there might be areas of the brain that were being affected in children that had high levels of cortisol because of the stress they were going through. First, we demonstrated that they did have these higher levels of cortisol, especially pre-bedtime. Second, in a longitudinal study, we saw that there was a connection between those high levels of cortisol and decreased key areas of the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex. So the link is there, the impact of trauma is there. What we want to move to now is like, well, what to do about it? How can then these interventions protect the developing brain from those effects? And how can interventions actually undo some of these things that I'm talking about? And do I believe they can be undone? Yes, because the brain, you've heard about the plasticity of the brain, but what's interesting is that the areas that I'm talking about are the cortical and the limbic areas of the brain, and those are the most plastic and most sensitive areas of the brain. That's why they get affected by trauma. But then what is the reverse of trauma, right? Good opportunities, good education, good nutrition, good therapy, right? Good interventions. Wouldn't that do the opposite of what I just described? Or wouldn't that protect from what I just described? That's what we are interested in. We're also very interested in the sleep architecture. Some of the data that I'm going to share with you today demonstrates that this yoga and mindfulness intervention that we call Pure Power, developed by Pure Edge, can actually impact the deep sleep of these children. And that's relevant for many reasons. But one important reason it is that it is during deep sleep that we process the events of the day. And if we actually don't process them, they don't disappear. They just stay there, but they don't get filed. They kind of float around and they manifest as symptoms. So during deep sleep, we actually make sense of what happened and store it somewhere. Something that was very alarming to me, we did this project in East Palo Alto, which is a community population, right? It was not a clinical population. But when I looked at the baseline before the intervention, the deep sleep, it was significantly lower than what it needed to be. These kids were spending like 15% of their time in deep sleep when adults like us are spending like 25%. So neonates spend like 80% of their time in deep sleep, and you're supposed to, as you get to become an adult, to reduce that to about 25, but not 15 when you're a child. But something that I'm happy to share with you is that the more yoga these kids have done, and the more mindfulness these kids have done through Pure Power, that deep sleep has increased in terms of percentage. And I'm able to show you some preliminary data there. So all this neuroscience talk is a book that we have, is all really that we know in the Neuroscience of Pediatric PTSD. It's a very thin book. Don't be too afraid of it. We need to know a lot more. But it's not adult PTSD. It is different. Every condition has a life of its own. We tend to look at things as pediatric or adult. But the reality is that PTSD has its own life, right? So it goes developing throughout the years. So for example, if you meet a 10-year-old whose allostatic load started when he was 5, this is a 5-year-old PTSD, which is different than a 35-year-old who just had the first incident, right? That's very acute versus a chronic. So the child versus adult doesn't work. It's more the length of time, the duration that backpack has been there too heavy. How to promote resilience? We've talked about this a little bit. Academic opportunities, support, enhancing emotional regulation, enhancing executive function, that ability to organize, to think, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. I need to take these papers because I need to give them to the teacher, things like that. And very important, how to help children become citizens, how to help children become socially engaged, which means that they have to develop their social skills, their emotional skills, and this is not going to happen de novo. They need to learn it, and we call that socio-emotional learning. We call that SEL. And Pure Power and us in Early Life Stress are working on that as well to develop methods that can help teach this to teachers so that they can help teach it to the students. And the theory of belonging that I talked about before. So I've talked about Pure Edge. What's this? Oh, this is the Q Center treatment, and if we have time, we can talk a little bit more about that. It is based on classical conditioning. Kids don't understand what's happening, so it is important to tell them what is traumatic stress, what is PTSD, what is this reaction that you're having. Many of us don't even like the D in PTSD. That it's not really a disorder, that is a reaction that the body is having to something that happened. So sometimes we refer to it as post-traumatic stress injury, right? And very much like when we break our arm and we go to the emergency room, and in order to put it back together, they need to touch it, and it's going to hurt, but it's the only way the arm is going to get better. The same thing with these experiences. If we don't talk about them, they're not going to disappear. In order for them to be processed, we need to talk about them. So here's this thing that I always tell my team, that PTSD feeds on avoidance. And that if we really need to fight it, we need to use approach. we need to talk about it. And it's going to hurt. But like the arm, it goes back in place. So there's more to that we can talk about later. Pure Power is this program that I said that integrates yoga and mindfulness to teach kids at school. And then to talk to us more about Pure Edge, which is the company that developed Pure Power, we have the CEO with us today, Chi Kim, who's going to talk to us more about this. And then we're going to do, after that, we'll go do the Starfish project.
Great, thank you.
Let me give you the
No, I
mic.
have it. I'm
Oh, you have it. All right.
Hi, good evening. My name is Chi Kim, and I have the honor and privilege of running a private operating foundation called Pure Edge. And we're a little bit of a hybrid of sorts. We're a private operating foundation. On one side of the house, we actually have created content that's open source. If you are a nonprofit agency, or if you are in schools or work with youth, you can actually log onto our website and get access to all the content. It's pre-K through 12. We have videos and curricula. There's 1,200 pages of curriculum, which no one will probably ever use that much, but we have everything sort of resourced, and it's open source, and that will always be available for free for folks to use in youth. The other side of our house is we're also a grantor, and so we provide grant dollars for national organizations that support social emotional learning. So we provide a grant and we support CASEL, which is the Collaborative for Academic and Social Emotional Learning based out in Chicago. We've supported the Aspen Institute, and also we are one of the funders for the research for the Compassionate Schools Project in Louisville, Kentucky. And so we feel that when we go into these partnerships, and we've been so lucky to work with Dr. Carrion, we've learned so much in the past few years. What we actually ended up doing through this, we initially started out with putting yoga in schools, and what we ended up finding is that we had to transition from just serving students. What we ended up finding out is that you can always get resources and to help students and do that, except for we have an entire collective of educators that no one is actually taking care of. And so in the process of actually taking care of the students in these schools, we've actually started working with Dr. Mark Greenberg and Tish Jennings and Krista Turksma, who've been doing care and really talking about developing supports for educators. They did a large study in New York City public schools and really found that when you actually take care of the educators and talk about their own support for self-care, academic outcomes, social outcomes, the actual environment in which they teach improve with just the support for the teachers. So we learned from both of those things. We talked about teacher stress. So what we've done is actually developed curricula based on the research that Dr. Carrion has done with us in East Palo Alto. And we have units of study. It's called Pure Power. So every child has the power to develop certain series. And at the same time, what we've actually found is that the unit that the kids loved the most was about neuroscience. And so we actually pull that out based on feedback from the teachers. So learning about the brain, really talking about ways in which you actually have some control over how things go. We talk about being responsive versus being reactive. And we talk a little bit about just simple strategies that they can use. And Anne is going to demonstrate that piece. What we also did at the same time is we realized that we have an entire population of non-English speakers, predominantly because we were in California, actually had everything translated into Spanish. And we had the great fortune last January. We've been working on the island of Puerto Rico for the last year and a half. We served 15,000 educators on the island after the hurricane, and we brought Dr. Carrion in, and he actually trained 2,000 social workers, school psychologists, and high school and school counselors. Two approaches. One, as a prevention, that's Pure Power, and as an intervention, Q-centered therapy. So we were able to do that as well. All of our materials we've just have actually aligned with the CASEL competencies. The CASEL 5 is what we call them. Really being able to, and we focus mostly on self-awareness, self-management, and actually social awareness. We know that there's this piece where folks are talking about mindfulness in schools and teaching kids at age 5 mindfulness. Dr. Greenberg was really clear about one thing. When they're 5, because it's an invitation, we're actually teaching self-regulation. It's really not teaching them mindfulness. And I just want to make sure that we are all of the same mindset, that we're actually really trying to have them learn self-regulation skills so they can be present in a classroom to be able to learn and kind of have the best conditions for success. So we really want to be careful in how we approach the work. We're teaching mindful movement and a lot of breath work for our youngsters. And then as the kids get older, they get invited to do these things. And Anne actually is one of our incredible instructors, trainers nationally, but she also was an instructor in East Palo Alto and working with middle school students. As I shared, all of our resources are free, and they will be there. We add video content and things like that there. It's just pureedgeinc.org, and if you go up on, I think, right here, you can do online curriculum, and you'll get access to all the back-end resources. So we are very proud to say that we have over 8,000 online users, and I think in the last 2 years, because of the shift, we've actually been serving school districts. We work with children. We used to start, giving grants, having them work with children, but because we've actually shifted over strategy to really focus on the adults who serve the children, in the last 2 years we've served over 30,000 educators, and we actually lump educators as anyone who works in a school system that actually impacts the lives of kids. We are very grateful and fortunate to be able to work in some pretty large systems. Anne is actually responsible for San Diego Unified. We've been working in Philadelphia Public Schools. We're going to start working in Providence, Rhode Island. We just feel really grateful and lucky to be able to provide some resources at no cost to the places that we serve, just as a way of showing gratitude for the adults who serve our future. So that's sort of how we operate. We talk about prevention in that when Dr. Carrion was talking about the triangle, we like to believe if you're in a school system, are there any teachers or educators in this space? Yeah. So we talk about tier 1 supports where it's a universal. So we really believe that pure power can be a universal. It can be taught either in elementary settings, it's PE classes. Sometimes it's used in the classroom. Sometimes if you're in a middle school setting, it can be in one of the wheels in the rotations for electives. And then in a secondary setting, we've talked about using, I know Anne's teaching right now in San Diego as a freshman seminar class. And so we have lots of different kinds of variations for doing that. But we just believe very strongly that when we provide these resources and take care of the adults first, we go through, talk about the neuroscience of stress and their allostatic load and some strategies there. They're much more, we believe that if they experience the practices themselves, they're much more likely to use it in the classroom. We don't ever want to do unto educators. I think they're told to do things all the time. And so what we like to do is approach from a place of just being grateful for what they do and being open to providing some strategies that they can use. So I'm going to have Anne actually do one practice that's in our, I'm going to go back this way, that's in our curriculum. And we call them brain breaks. It's not a unique term for us, but we do like to give strategies that are simple, short, and that they could use at the beginning, middle, during transition times and things as well. This is one of our favorites. Yes, you're welcome. We're very close.
All right. So let's everybody stand up. You can do most of these practices sitting or standing, but because we've been sitting for a while and it shows a little bit of the transition and it doesn't take very long, it's just nice to stretch it out a little bit, right? Okay, so extend your favorite arm forward. Okay, and you're going to use your index finger. You're going to place it on the bottom of the thumb. Okay, we're going to trace the outline of the hand, and on the inhale, you're going to come on up. Coming over the top of the thumb. On the exhale, you're going to come down to the groove. Somebody's breathing really good right now. Inhale through the nose. Exhale through the nose. If you have a cold or allergies, feel free to breathe through the mouth. Inhale. Exhale. Inhale. Exhale. Inhale, exhale. We're going to go the other way. Inhale, exhale. Inhale, exhale. Inhale, exhale. 2 more fingers to go. Inhale, exhale. Inhale. Exhale. Beautiful job. Shake it out. Just note, if you teach middle school, you know they like to go fast, so slow it down. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Anne, and
You're welcome.
thank you, Chi. Breathing is so important, right? So why is breathing the anchor to all of this? I don't know. But I do know that it's something that keeps us alive. It distinguishes us from people that are not alive, right? So it's life. It's breathing is life. And one might think that one breathes all the time. But check in with yourself once in a while. Sometimes our breaths are very shallow. Sometimes, maybe it's me, I find myself totally not breathing at all. And you have to start breathing. And to do that in a very conscientious way, feeding yourself with oxygen and having that oxygen go to your muscles and relaxing those muscles is a very, very good thing. Okay. So this collaboration with Peer Power, we wanted to put this to the test because we both became concerned that with the advent of mindfulness and yoga in schools and all of that, that many people were doing many different things. And that's very risky. It's very risky because mindfulness really could get a bad reputation if just a couple people do the wrong thing. So we wanted to do something that had fidelity, that was structured, that had some flexibility to it, that was feasible, and that was tested. And that when it was tested the right way. So the right way for me, when you do look at development, is to do a longitudinal study and not a cross-sectional study. So this is a study that took 3 years to do. Another thing to do is to have a control group, because when you do a longitudinal study, much of this, like I was just talking about the prefrontal cortex, right, can happen by development. So how do we control for that? Well, we look for a group that is very similar to the group where we're making the intervention, but we don't give them the intervention and we do the same assessments. That's not easy, but we were able to do that. And we were able to have partners in schools that were able to do that with us. Then we looked at a multi-method approach. So we didn't want to look to see if they felt better or if they were just sleeping better. We wanted to look at everything. We actually, is one of the first studies to actually do polysomnography with kids. We actually have records of their sleep architecture. And that's why I can talk to you about the deep state of the deep stages of the sleep. But also looking at brain function and looking at brain structure through MRI, looking at academics, and looking at behavioral outcomes as well. So it was a big study. We started, like I said, in 2014. We started with intervention group first, then the control came into the picture, and then the control kind of pushed us more towards the end because they started later. And we are now here in the process of data analysis and publication, and have published a paper in Nature on the baseline outcomes of this. As you can imagine, this was an intervention that we did with 6,000 kids in the whole East Palo Alto School District, from kindergarten to 8th, right? 8th or 12th? 8th. And so like 6,000 kids. So not all of them could be part of the study, that we couldn't manage that. So we were just looking at 3rd graders and 5th graders, which I thought were good grades. But I wish we would have looked at who? At the kindergartners. Because for them, you see them now on 3rd grade, and you ask them, what about the intervention? And they look at you like you have 2 heads. It's like, what do you mean intervention? I do this like I brush my teeth. And not only they do it, and it's part of their day, and they do it whenever they want to, they teach it, and they take it home. And so that's how much I can tell you about kindergartners. But we do have data on the third graders and on the fifth graders. In general, the younger they were, the better in terms of doing it and participating. We really need to do that. We really needed to do this study because of the depression, anxiety, allostatic load that we have in our nation is an epidemic. And as you know, many times this ends in suicide, right? That we cannot control, right? It's like the cancer of mental health, right? There are things that we try to attend and sometimes we can't. But something that's happening is that it's getting worse, even with all these advances in science and in mental health. And this is how it's getting worse. These are the nationwide suicide trends in Americans that are older than 10 years old. The CDC did an account in 2016. These are states where the increase was from 6 to 18%. States where the increase was 19 to 30%. States where the increase was 31 to 37%. And states where the increase was 38 to 58%. All age groups have increased, both genders. Girls in the early to mid teenage years is the most affected group. Okay? So I'm not saying, oh, let's give yoga and mindfulness and the suicide trends will go down. What I'm saying is we need to look at everything. We need to look at every intervention. We need to look at anything we can do beyond the field of medicine, in other fields, working multidisciplinarily, working in partnerships. And we're not even saying that a partnership is it. We want to bring even more people into the group. We know the law school is interested. We know the School of Education is interested. We know technology people are interested. And that's what it's going to take. It's going to require an institute, really, that brings all of these people together, not to think about it, but to actually come up with solutions for this big problem. So this is very early. We're still cleaning the data. It's a big, large data set, but I did want to share some things with you. That one of the things that really jumped right away was spelling. Spelling improves with yoga and mindfulness. So what is spelling? Spelling is the correct retrieval of sequentially stored, virtually random bits of information. So you have information all over the brain, and when you are a good speller, it means that you are good at bringing that information together. It's an indication that different brain networks are connecting efficiently to perform a task. I'm not sure where that's going to take us. I'm just sharing that with you because it's one of the things that we are looking at. But we want to continue to look at this academic improvement and how that may lead to behavioral change, but how all these things connect, right? So it's not a matter of having improved brain function in an area. Is, well, did that happen because there's better sleep? And because of the better sleep and the better brain function, then you're performing better academically? That's one possibility, but you can imagine how many other possibilities could there be. So when you have a multi-method data set like this, you can really explore some of these questions, which is what we are going to be doing. I talked a little bit about sleep. Rapid eye movement in particular is very key for neuronal development and cognitive performance. So besides deep sleep being important, in particular, rapid eye movement is something that we also want to look at. Let's see. And also sleep disruption, is a risk. It's a risk factor for developing anxiety, for developing depression, for developing PTSD, we really, all of us, need to sleep well, which means good amount of deep sleep in 7 to 8 hours at our age. So please get that. The sleep study looked at controls and looked at the experimental group, the intervention group, like I mentioned, but also look at the intervention group as they were starting the intervention, and was able to realize that there were no major differences between the 3 groups when we initiated the study in terms of their sleep. But at time 1, there were some differences in that this sample from East Palo Alto, which, like I said, is not a clinical sample, is really a community sample, was really spending very little time in REM specifically. So what we have here is the increase in total sleep time following the intervention of the yoga and the mindfulness. So here you have days exposure to intervention, right? So this is pre-intervention. So what you have is a bunch of people, right? That some are sleeping better than others. So you get an average line. But as soon as you start the intervention, which happens here, and you start increasing the intervention, we see this line increasing in terms of total sleep time. So the total sleep time, and you can have many theories about that. I cannot tell you why, right? Maybe you're more tired because you did yoga during the day, or you had to do mindfulness exercises. But by the way, we did this during the PE time, which was not being used for PE, as many of you know. So we were very happy on being able to bring a physical activity to the PE time. Other types of sleep, slow wave sleep, also increase with the curriculum. And then here specifically, we have that rapid eye movement increasing. Now, like I said, we also collected cortisol because of that previous research that we had done. And we wanted to see how the cortisol was doing here. And what we saw was that there was a larger decrease from morning to night associated with better functioning. And what that means is that overall, there's no such a high load of cortisol as with my PTSD samples that I had studied previously, where they had very high elevated levels. But these we want to go beyond that, right? This readjusting of what we call the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis that leads to the secretion of cortisol. Does that have anything to do with the rest of it? For example, with sleep. So what we see is that there's better cortisol is associated with more REM sleep in a dose response group. So the better the adjustment of the cortisol in terms of that ratio of being lower at the end of the day, right? The better the improvement in REM. So they're associated. It's still not cause and effect necessarily, but it's one of the areas that we're going to explore. So I'm just presenting you some tidbits of the data that we have looked at. We're going to really be doing that for the rest of this year and next year. It's a big database, but there is improvement in cortisol, I can tell you that, with the intervention. There is improvement on sleep, I can tell you that. And very excitingly, there's also if we have time, we'll come to those. But there's improve on brain function. So when you do functional MRI, fMRI, you actually can have tasks that require executive function or tasks that require for you to regulate your emotion. And what we see is that the networks associated with those activities are performing better in the intervention group when compared to the control group. So for example, this is a task of being able to regulate your emotion, right? You're seeing something that is distressing, but then being told you're going to see it again. can you control how distressed you feel? What we see is that if you are in the control group not receiving the intervention, there's no much of a change when you see these pictures. For example, in the aversive one, it's actually more aversive the second time. With the intervention, the kids that are intervention are able to decrease their negative experience to all of the pictures, even the neutral ones. And what that indicates is that they have a better ability of regulating their emotion. Okay? The amygdala is the emotional core center of the brain, very much involved with anxiety, with stress, with that hypervigilance that I was talking about. After the mindfulness intervention, children in the intervention group showed decreased amygdala reactivity to aversive images. And we didn't see that in the control group. So here you can see the drop before and after of amygdala activity in the intervention group. And then the insula and the anterior cingulate cortex are two areas that work with the prefrontal cortex in terms of rewards and the ability to process rewards and wait for the right amount of reward. The task, for example, is one where you see a balloon that's pumping up and you can like press one more time and it either is going to explode and you lose all the quarters that you've accumulated, or you can cash out, right? So you can see kids that are very conservative, right, and little by little accumulate all their quarters. And then you can see the kids that like explode all the time and they live with no quarters at all. The kids that are in the intervention group, as opposed to the control group, are actually able to engage these areas of the brain to do the task better. I don't want to say too much about what that means. I don't want to start, making stuff up. But these are things that we're going to be looking at. So in terms of spectrum of interventions, education, promotion, prevention, treatment when needed, use of technology, we basically have to do it all. And we have to find ways in which, as a group, we can do it all. Ongoing support, opportunities, advocacy, creating policy. This is a text on mindfulness that I co-edited with John Redger, which was in our group last year, Applied Mindfulness. And this is a book on PTSD that touches on many of the things that we've talked about today in terms of treatment and other things. So let's talk a little bit about the ecology of building resilient communities, because we really have to think about this in terms of an ecosystem. We really have to think about it in terms of, we've talked about something very specific today, right? Like the brain or the nerve cell. That's the microcosm of the problem. Then you have the child. But if you make that lens bigger and bigger, then you get to schools, and then you get to society, and then you get to policy. And all of these circles are interwoven, and all of these circles need to be educated, right? So it's not the child, right? When we talk about education, when we talk about being mindful, when we talk about being having gratitude towards each other, it's not the child, but it's all of those systems. So a resilient, but we have to start with the individual, because a resilient community is built by resilient individuals. Different institutions and partners need to work together. Sustainability and funding is essential. So this needs to be addressed from the beginning, right? These are good ideas, but how are we going to implement them? How are we going to put them in place? Government presence helps facilitate implementation, dissemination, impact. I had a very nice conversation with Tia just before we started, when we talked that, for me, the end point is always that whatever findings we have don't end up in some journal in the library, but that we can actually develop programs and implement them in the community and build policy. And that's like the extent of how I was thinking about it. Like it ends with policy. And Tia just reminded me, well, actually after policy, you still have to make sure that it gets implemented in the right way, because just because you have the policy doesn't mean that it's going to happen. So it's endless, right? It's endless work, but it requires all of those steps. And then addressing groups with the same interventions as we would individuals. So I invite all of you, we don't have to talk about this, we can talk about anything that you want, but I do invite you to think about programs that promote resilience that you have tried in your community, and what are the aspects that have made some of these work, or what are the aspects that have made some of those not work, fail, and how can we create a resilient network that support each other's efforts. Let me, before the discussion, share something else that, well, I guess this was the sleep. I did talk about that. This is just showing in some other way the improvement of REM sleep in the kids that had the intervention. Okay, so I am going, well, let me, before we get into the discussion, thank everyone from my team and everyone from Pure Power that make this study possible, all the supporters, and the kids.
It may not be the real reason of what mindful means, but what it means to me is being more calm, less stress, and having more fun, because life is supposed to be about fun.
So it certainly is about more fun. We're going to have a lot of fun with that database, let me tell you that. But let's see. Okay, so I'm going to leave these questions here, and maybe that can help you think a little bit about what we want to discuss or anything else that we have talked about today. So any questions or comments?
I would love you to talk more about working with parents, and like, does Pure Edge have a parent participation thing, and also just work with parents?
Yeah, so I'm writing a book on childhood right now. I'm not a parent, and I consider it essential to talk with parents to write this book. I have learned so much from parents during the past, 30 plus years in this field. And so a lot of what I do and a lot of the research and a lot of the design is informed by what the parents bring to the office. But more specifically, in terms of intervention, the best way to treat trauma is to engage the whole family, right? However, what I found when I was about to do that was that many parents were not ready to do the work when kids were ready to do the work. In the old approach, that kid would have never been involved in treatment. The Q-center therapy asks that the parent is involved out of 15 to 16 sessions in 4 of the sessions at key time points. Not by design, not strategically because we think that's the best thing. We really would like them to be there for the whole thing. But we work with families where if a parent misses one day from their work, they may get fired. And then we also work with parents that have been also traumatized, and that the avoidance is so big that it doesn't allow them to participate as active as they would wish to do, while the kid is really ready to start. So we have this approach to involve the kid, with a limited involvement of the parent. But in terms of Pure Power, you want to say something?
So when we go into partnership for school districts, oftentimes they'll ask us if we'll do parent trainings as part of our sessions. One of our partner districts locally in San Jose, we actually, they have Parent University. So they'll actually have a weekend where they invite parents, and we've done sessions there. It just depends on how the district approaches their parent engagement opportunities.
I'm curious, I'm a parent of, I have 3 children, 2 do a lot of mindfulness and yoga and have with them forever. I had a child who had some PTSD after a terrible horse accident, and my yoga teacher happened to have been trained in, to work with vets. So I asked her, and I gave my daughter a strategy, and it was so effective. But anyway, my third child is a son, and he's the classic boy who won't ask for directions. I'm just curious, in your studies, did you see a difference between your boys and girl population? And now they're younger, they're pre-puberty, but I'm still very curious what you saw. Or maybe it's just my parents' style.
Yeah, we're going to look at that. We haven't looked at it yet, so I
will
cannot
tell you
you.
Qualitatively, when we interviewed some of the children, so the boys, they were the ones that sort of messed around in class, it's yoga, we don't want to do this. But when they were actually doing the interviews or did some of the reflections, they were the ones that were using the strategies at home in the quiet where no one else really was watching. So they ended up having, just qualitatively, they would share that with us. There was some sort of social cred, when you're in public and you don't want to be the boy that does this. But we've actually found that they take the strategies and take them much more deeply than some of the girls did, just from the reflections.
I'm also wondering about how much kids like to own things, and not a gender thing, but the fact that this is something his sisters did.
Or his mother.
and if there's some way to formulate it like, oh, you came up with doing it that way, you're going to be the only one that does it that way, he may pick it up.
And also the sports activity. So when so Anne has actually taught it where you're doing warrior pose to actually try and train your body for other sports activities. So that happened to be another way in which the PE classes would use yoga instruction for, stretch exercises and really being able to build in flexibility. So. Anil? Oh, yes, sir.
Okay, go ahead. Are the suicide rates increasing worldwide like they are in the U.S.?
We don't know. I don't know the data internationally. What I know is that when the CDC came, they found these clusters, not everywhere in the United States, but that there were pockets of clusters in different areas, here and Texas and Connecticut and New York. This numbers show that it's really all over the place, but those were more the clusters. Internationally, I don't know. Do you guys know? I don't know. But it's an important question to see if it's something that we are not doing right. Of course, we would have to see the way that they gather the data, right, to make sure that it's the same way.
One thing I just wanted to add, just from your question, is no one ever contacts us when things are going well, ever. So, we have the great fortune and where it's an unfortunate situation, but there's usually a triggering event that has a district person contact us. More often than not, it's actually a suicide or some trauma. And I don't mean like gun violence in that way, but I mean a real triggering event for the community. And suicide happens to be one of our most common outreach.
So, first of all, congratulations, Victor, and Angie, on this wonderful research. It's
Thank you.
a pleasure to see something like that. Question. There's always this conversation around the mind and the body, and obviously it's an intertangled system. Do you have a sense of the extent to which the mind and body is synergistic versus additive? Would you say that, if synergy is defined as the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, is there an interaction effect, a synergy effect, that if you were to look at studies that were mindfulness-based versus studies that were, sort of physical-based, and you add those two, you get A plus B, versus a synergy of bringing the two? It may be too preliminary, but I'm just...
No, that's really interesting, and one of the things that I used to do with kids was that I would write in the prescription pad exercise. I would give it to them, and they would take it more seriously if I had just said exercise for some reason. But many of these kids, the sweating of the hands, the increase in heart rate is classical conditioning, right, is aligned with something negative. It doesn't feel good. I want them to have experiences later in their life where they're going to be sweating and their heart rate is going to be beating that they are enjoying, right? So exercise is the means to get them to that point, because they're going to start having little by little accelerated heart rate and sweating, and they're going to see that it's in a positive context, right? That it's not something negative. That's one thing. I often also think about a triangle between exercise, nutrition, and mood. And not that those three have to be optimal, but what I've seen is that if you work on one of them, the other two follow. And so there's a little bit there of the link between the body and the mind. But most of the time I don't separate them. You know, for me, when you give gratitude, you know, your dopamine is being released. And that's why it's good to do good things for other people and for yourself, because it's going to be healthy. It's going to help your health too. Any thoughts on that?
I was just saying one of our main tenets is really just breathe, move, rest. And that's our very simple way in which we approach the work with adults and with kids, that because it's all connected, and we really talk about toning the vagus nerve. So that vagal tone is really something that we focus on centrally for our trainings. But yeah, it's been really interesting, because if you think about how schooling is done in the country, right? It's just one academic portion, and now there's this shift to try and actually take into consideration the whole human being, which we all know when you are a great teacher, you've done that anyways, right? So, hi, Luca.
Hi, how are you doing, Chi? Great to see you. Thank you so much for your presentation today. It's just a great segue. So I know it's preliminary, it's fantastic, but if we're doing system design for education systems, and we're looking at where the rubber hits the road, to the ecological model, what are the kind of preliminary advice or recommendations you would give to move beyond the kind of academic paradigm? You know, we put students into classrooms and have them sit at an individual desk at worst, all over the world. And so, you know, this kind of notion of having a holistic approach to the way we educate is vital. So what's some words of advice you'd give for people working in systems?
I say for us, it's start with the educators, start with the adults, right? We do so many things to try and help kids, and we always want to go in and put the interventions in place for the classrooms, but we really believe strongly that we have to start with the adults, help, and you know, by having and allowing them to feel what it feels like when they go through practices. That is one major component for us, that when the adults are actually going through some of these, you know, we don't get 100% buy-in ever, but we get enough that if there's one teacher there that loves it, we know that they're going to use it in the classroom. So in that very direct way, systems-wise, we actually don't go into any district unless the superintendent or the leadership team is on board. The MOU is with the district. It is not with the classroom teacher. It is not with a school. It is with a district. And so we specifically go in as a systems approach. So we try to do that as well.
Some of the schools that had the best fidelity had rooms that were specific for yoga, right?
Yes.
Where they could actually go at any time during the day. And they would go on their own besides when they were having the regular class. So they would go at the end of the day, or they would go during recess. I don't know if they would go during class. I don't think they would go during class time. But so making it, you know, flexible. And I think that I don't know, I was just thinking about this when you talked about, you know, why do we care so much about academics? Well, because there's an outcome, right, associated with that. We need to really be better at communicating what is the outcome of having good socio-emotional health. Because for many people it's like, yeah, that would be nice, right? But if we say, no, actually colleges, you know, are looking at SEL scores, then all of a sudden there might be increased interest in that. So we need to start thinking that way.
Do you have any anecdotal data, you know, you're still analyzing that data, on the parents, any comments on behavior change in the children that were part of the interventional part of the study, or even with your program?
We have, let me think about this, because we have some qualitative data of what their experience was like. Many parents, as you can imagine, ended up learning the interventions from their kids. So they would come and they would tell us their stories, right? And all we did was writing them down. So we do have some qualitative data on that, and it's like 90% positive. I mean, it was very good for parents, which is one of the reasons why I didn't want the control to be another classroom in the same school or another school in the same district, because these things, fortunately, disseminate well. So it was another whole district in San Jose, so it was different. But yeah.
I have one anecdote for in New York City. So we had the program in New York City, and it was an elementary school, and we actually found, and this was not, I mean, this is for students with special needs, the program actually worked really well for them, because oftentimes we say, pay attention, stay focused, but they don't know how to do that. And because the instruction is very explicit, we actually saw the most change in terms of having readiness skills to learn when students were identified with some, they had not a whole lot of self-regulation skills themselves, but because it was so explicit, that was really helpful for them. And parents shared that with us pretty robustly.
Yeah.
Did you do any of the physiological measures on the teacher and see if there were cohort X where in the teacher's physiology was more in the health range, deep sleep, low cortisol, etc. If those students had
I want you to comment.
a greater benefit?
Thank you. We did not. However, some physiological reactions are very observable. and I don't know, Anne can talk more about this, but I think when teachers were more calm and more receptive to this, those classrooms tended to do better.
True.
And there was something else I was going to say, and I forgot.
The CARE study that Dr. Jennings did, that actually sort of lays out that very piece. I don't know if they've done cortisol samples or things like that, but it definitely has a lot of information about just calming.
Yeah, but it's worth thinking about, because it's the main intervention that Pure Power is doing now. It's with teachers.
Right.
So.
And there's been some, you may know there's some interesting research in Germany about physicians, that if the patient is being offered these practices, but if their physician has been doing the practices, the patient does better if their physician practiced that morning.
That
Correct.
makes a lot of
That's right.
sense.
I apologize, I have a red-eye flight practice.
On the go.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for your
Thank you, Chief. Thank you.